Hi, this is Elliot from EO Nutrition, and in this video today we are going to be looking closely at a nutrient called thiamine. This is an essential B vitamin. It's called vitamin B1, but the name is thiamine, and what we're going to be looking at today is how thiamine is absolutely crucial for maintaining healthy gut function. We are going to examine the various ways that a lack of thiamine or a chronic thiamine deficiency could actually lead to many different types of gut disorders or gut dysfunction, okay? This can range from small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. It could be gastroparesis or gastroesophageal reflux. It could be any kind of motility disorder, and it could be related to a lack of digestive enzyme secretion along with bile flow and stomach acid production. Okay, so at the start of the presentation we will cover the basics. We'll look at how thiamine is dealt with by the human body and some of the reactions that it's involved in systemically with regard to energy metabolism, and we'll also then go on to look at some of the more specific roles that it has in the gut and maintaining digestive function. Right, so to begin with, it's important to really try to flesh out some of the ways that the body or understand some of the ways that the body uses thiamine, and to really appreciate why thiamine is so crucial. So when we think of thiamine, vitamin B1, one of the most well-established roles of thiamine is actually in relation to glucose metabolism. So the body is always burning some amount of glucose, whether you are consuming carbohydrates in your diet or not. There are certain cells which cannot metabolize fats, and so we will always be synthesizing some level of glucose and actually burning that. And thiamine is essential for any form of glucose metabolism. So essentially, thiamine is what we call a cofactor. And now a cofactor is essentially when you have enzymes. Enzymes are proteins which catalyze the conversion of one thing to another thing, okay? And we use enzymes for lots of different processes, and enzymes generally need or require something called a cofactor. A cofactor is something which the enzyme uses to speed up the reaction. So you can have cofactors which essentially activate enzymes to allow them to do what they need to do by taking one thing and converting it into another thing. And so thiamine is a cofactor for many different enzymes. And the first enzyme we're going to look at is actually called pyruvate dehydrogenase. So as you can see in the diagram here, we have, I'll give you an example. Let's say that we consume carbohydrates. When we digest carbohydrates, we are breaking them down into glucose, and we absorb glucose, and glucose is transported into the cells. When it enters the cells in the cytosol, it's going to go through a process called glycolysis. This is essentially how we are breaking down glucose into two constituent molecules of what we call pyruvate. Okay, so to take energy, the energy stored within the glucose molecule, we need to run it through several processes. And the first process being glycolysis. Once glucose has gone through this process, we are producing something called pyruvate. And for pyruvate to go on to the next step and to make something called acetyl coenzyme A, we are going to require an enzyme called pyruvate dehydrogenase. Pyruvate dehydrogenase is taking pyruvate that we've derived from glucose and actually converting it into acetyl coenzyme A. Okay, pyruvate dehydrogenase requires thiamine as a cofactor. So we see here just initially how thiamine is absolutely essential for glucose to be broken down for energy. In fact, you can think of pyruvate dehydrogenase it's the initial step by which glucose is transformed into the next set of energy carriers. It's really the doorway to glucose-based oxidative metabolism. And from that point onwards, we have acetyl coenzyme A. And acetyl coenzyme A, this is entering at something called the tricarboxylic acid cycle, or the citric acid cycle in the mitochondria. Okay, so we can derive acetyl coenzyme A from glucose, as you can see in the diagram, but we can also get acetyl coenzyme A from a process called beta oxidation of fats. Okay, so when we have this acetyl coenzyme A, what we're doing is it's going to be processed through this cycle whereby you have lots of different intermediates being converted into one another and basically generating these energy carrying molecules NADH and FADH2. And so there is an enzyme as part of the TCA cycle which is called alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. Okay, now alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase depends on several things for its function, but thymine is also one of those. Okay, so thymine, what we see here is that thymine is not only essential for glucose metabolism, but it's also essential for the metabolism or the breakdown of fats for energy. Okay, because ultimately both glucose and fat both need to enter into the TCA cycle to make ATP. Okay, so thymine is important for both of those reactions, or is a cofactor for both of those enzymes. And so alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, interestingly, it's not only involved in the breakdown of these macronutrients, but it's also involved in the synthesis of various neurotransmitters. So you have glutamate, you have gamma-aminobutyric acid, abbreviated GABA, you also have aspartate. So we see here how thymine is not only important for the breakdown of macromolecules for energy, but it's also important for neurotransmitters. And these are particularly, these are a major component of the neurological system, the nervous system, and how this is working. And so it gives you an idea as to how a subclinical thymine deficiency, or when there is low thymine status, how this can potentially affect the nervous system. And we're going to look into how this might happen later on in this video. But I just want to make it clear and kind of emphasize the point here that every single cell in the human body is going to require energy. And so cells, not only in the nervous system, but cells all throughout the periphery are going to be using this process of taking glucose, of taking fatty acids, and actually making usable energy. And so thymine is absolutely essential for both of these things. Thymine is also a cofactor, and we're not going to go into detail here, but it's a cofactor for an enzyme called branched-chain alpha-ketoacid dehydrogenase, and this is involved in the conversion of leucine to isovalyryl-CoA. Okay, so this is related to amino acid metabolism. And when there is a deficiency of thymine in relation to energy synthesis inside the cells, one of the things that the research shows is that thiamine deficiency actually reduces pyruvate dehydrogenase. So when pyruvate dehydrogenase is basically inhibited because of low thiamine status, it actually stops our body's ability to take glucose and convert it into pyruvate. And now if glucose is unable to go towards pyruvate, then what we're actually going to do is we are going to route it toward lactic acid or lactate. Okay, so when there's a block on pyruvate dehydrogenase because of thiamine deficiency, we're going to see glucose being routed toward lactate, and this is going to actually enter something called the Cori cycle. So when you produce lactic acid in elevated quantities, you might recognize this as if you've done some intense exercise and you get like a burn in your muscles, or you develop a stitch. This is essentially the process whereby your cells are making high levels of this lactic acid, and unfortunately you can't get much ATP from that. And so what's happening is you have to recycle the lactic acid, and that's the lactic acid, or the lactate, is going to be going to the liver to be reconverted into glucose so that it can be used again. And unfortunately, you're going to have a net loss of ATP when you are running through this process, because it actually costs your body ATP to be able to make glucose again from lactate. So ultimately, what I'm trying to say here is that when you have low thiamine, you have this inability to break down glucose properly. You're going to be producing lactate in elevated amounts, okay? And this is generally not a very good thing when it is chronic. Now, aside from what we've been talking about here in the breakdown of glucose, this is a catabolic reaction. So this means that we are essentially using thiamine to break things down. Whereas on the other hand, glucose, not only can it be broken down, but it can actually be used for what we call anabolic reactions. And this is actually to build things or to make new things. And so there is a pathway which you can shunt glucose towards, and this is actually called the pentose phosphate pathway. This is how we're taking glucose. We can either produce two things. We can make something called NADPH, and NADPH is essentially a reducing agent. This is able to regenerate glutathione, which is the cell's master antioxidant. It can be used to synthesize fatty acids and steroids and all of these cool things. So we need NADPH, which means that we need some level of glucose. And at the same time, you can also produce the precursor, which is called ribose 5-phosphate. And this can actually be used to make nucleic acids and whatnot. So glucose is essential for many different things. And thiamine, as we said before, thiamine is essential for glucose metabolism in many different ways. Thiamine being a cofactor for the enzyme transketolase. Transketolase, you can think of it almost like a bridge in the pentose phosphate pathway. It allows us to essentially adapt based on environmental needs. It can allow us to produce or to shift the resources of this pathway and essentially produce what we need to produce depending on the individual cell's context, if that makes sense. So you can think of transketolase as giving the cell some degree of metabolic flexibility, okay? Now, learn anything about thiamine, you may have actually learned that thiamine is key for the nervous system. And this is really the case. So thiamine, if you recall back to the diagram showing that thiamine is actually needed for pyruvate dehydrogenase, well, when you convert pyruvate into acetyl coenzyme A, you're taking acetyl CoA and you're actually routing that toward the production of a neurotransmitter, which is called acetylcholine. Okay, so thiamine is essential for acetylcholine synthesis. Deficiency actually shows when someone's thiamine deficiency, when someone is thiamine deficient, research shows that actually you have a marked decrease in acetylcholine synthesis. Furthermore, thiamine is a cofactor for an enzyme called glutamate dehydrogenase. Okay, so this is taking one of the excitatory neurotransmitters in the brain and essentially detoxifying it. So when you have a thiamine deficiency, you can no longer effectively break down glutamate. And when you have too much glutamate, due to the fact that it is an excitatory neurotransmitter, it can actually have an effect on the neurons whereby you're producing excessive reactive oxygen species and you're actually destroying the cells. Okay, you're producing neuronal damage. So generally, glutamate in high amounts is not a great thing, and we need thiamine to get rid of that. So there's another very interesting aspect to this actually, and it relates to another of the B vitamins, and this is vitamin B6. So as I'm sure many of the audience already know, some of the B6 that we're having in the diet is actually not in its active form, and so what we need to do is we need to activate it to something called Paradoxal 5-phosphate, and we do this via an enzyme called Paradoxal Kinase. Now interestingly, I'm not sure of the details of this, but there is research to show that Paradoxal Kinase is actually downregulated in thiamine deficiency. And so what this is theoretically going to mean is that if we are chronically thiamine deficient, then we're going to be less able to activate B6, and there's going to be less active B6 to allow us to do what we need to do, specifically related to neurotransmitters in the brain. How this relates to the brain is, you see, you need active vitamin B6 to essentially metabolize and act as a cofactor for various reactions relating to the neurotransmitters. For instance, one of the an amino acid called tryptophan. Tryptophan can go on to produce serotonin, and the enzyme which does this is actually reliant on activated vitamin B6. Now, if you have low P5P, then tryptophan is potentially going to be redirected toward a neurotoxic compound which is called quinolinic acid. Okay, now quinolinic acid is potentially going to be implicated in things like neuroinflammation, neuronal excitotoxicity, and these kinds of things. It can cause some damage to the neurons, and so it's not something that you want a lot of. And so we need active vitamin B6, and what it seems like is that to have activated vitamin B6, we're also going to need good thiamine status. Interestingly, thiamine, and Dr. Derek Lonsdale has spoken about this in his book, which I'll speak about a little bit later, but essentially it also appears to be involved, and they've known this for a very long time, in the conduction of nerve signals, so nerve conduction, and in neurotransmission. Now, I'm not sure, I couldn't really make sense of exactly how that works, and I think that there's lots of theories to how it works. I don't know if the scientists necessarily understand how it works just yet, but it does seem to be absolutely vital. So one key takeaway point here is that thiamine is really important for energy synthesis. This relates to cells throughout the whole body, but in particular, thiamine seems to be really important for the nervous system. And now we've talked about the nervous system, let's just go through, the nervous system. Let's go through the basics. Or the basics relating to one specific branch of the nervous system, which is actually called the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, if any of you have studied basic biology, then you will understand, or you may be familiar with this, but for those who aren't, we'll briefly go over the basics. The autonomic nervous system is essentially the subsection, or the branch of the nervous system which is involved in the control of homeostasis. Basically, the control of the involuntary processes that are happening all of the time in your body that you don't necessarily need to think about. These are non-conscious processes, okay? If you had to think about them, you would be dead already. So for instance, this is your heartbeat. This is the constriction of your blood vessels, your blood pressure, your digestion, your bladder control. I mean, practically everything that you think of is controlled by the autonomic nervous system to some degree, okay? And as part of that, we have two branches, two further sub-branches of the autonomic nervous system. You have the sympathetic branch and you have the parasympathetic branch, as you can see on the diagram. So the autonomic nervous system, the way that it essentially maintains homeostasis in the body, or some degree of balance, let's say, is actually via shifting the dominance to between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches, okay? So certain times of the day or in certain situations, we will be more sympathetic dominant, meaning that the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, these functions are going to be active, whereas at other times of the day or in other certain situations, we are going to be shifting toward parasympathetic. And so there is really a balance that needs to be maintained between these to promote health, okay? And so the simple way that you can think about this is that the autonomic nervous system allows the body to adapt to the environment in the best way possible. Okay, it does this without you having to think about it. And so the autonomic nervous system, there are a very specific set of areas of the brain which are responsible for really controlling or regulating how well this system is working. And the cells which are responsible for doing this, they're located in the lower regions of the brain, actually referred to as the brainstem and the limbic system. And so in these cells, they require a very high rate of metabolism to function, a high rate of oxygen consumption, and because of that, these cells are using lots of glucose, they're using lots of thymine. What this essentially means is that these brain areas are particularly susceptible to Thiamine deficiency. It's been shown that essentially Thiamine deficiency, the regions of the brain, as you can see on the diagram, these are the first to go, okay? And so when you have a deficiency of Thiamine in these areas, essentially what you're going to have is defective energy metabolism, because we've seen how important Thymine is for metabolizing energy. Cells need energy to perform their functions, and when they lack energy, essentially they're not going to be able to do what they need to do. And so when you have defective energy metabolism in these brain regions, you actually develop what is called a dysautonomia, or a dysfunction of the autonomic control centers. Okay, this means that we're no longer able to effectively regulate how well this autonomic nervous system is functioning. For instance, what a dysautonomia could manifest as is a sympathetic dominance or a parasympathetic dominance. Okay, it means that we're no longer able to effectively adapt to what's going on around us. And so the early stages of Thiamine deficiency, these produce symptoms which are essentially dysautonomic. Okay, so you have various kind of symptoms. I mean, here are a few on the screen. You have tachycardia, cardiac arrhythmias, bowel dysmotility, irregular sweating, gastroparesis, all of these kinds of things. And if you look at these symptoms, the reason why is because these are the functions. For instance, bowel motility is partially governed by the autonomic nervous system. Sweating is governed by the autonomic nervous system, the rate of the heartbeat. So tachycardia is elevated heart rate, and essentially the heart rate is governed by the autonomic nervous system. So it's not it's not rocket science to understand why, if you have poor energy metabolism in those regions of the brain due to something like a thiamine deficiency, then this would actually lead to these kinds of symptoms. And so something I haven't mentioned just yet is actually the third branch of the autonomic nervous system, or what some researchers would call its own branch, is actually the enteric nervous system, otherwise known as the second brain or the gut brain. This is essentially localized to the gut, and this is really takes center stage in terms of modulating what is going on in the gut and transferring information to the central nervous system, and then communicating messages from the central nervous system back into the gut. Okay, and so as a general rule, you see you have sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation to the organs involved in digestion. And as a general rule, this is not a black and white rule, but as a general rule, the sympathetic innervation, the sympathetic branch of the nervous system, is essentially exerting an inhibitory effect on digestive activities. This is one of the reasons why people will typically tell you not to eat when you're stressed, or not to rush your food. It's actually to be mindful to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is essentially having the opposite effect, which is promoting things like digestive enzyme secretion and gastrointestinal motility. Okay, so the parasympathetic input is coming from the vagus nerve. Okay, it's mainly the vagus nerve which is innovating with these digestive organs and actually responsible for maintaining healthy digestive function. So to quickly look at the vagus nerve being part of the autonomic nervous system, it's originating at that part of the brain that we were talking about earlier, the brainstem, a set of cells called the dorsal motor nucleus of the medulla, and this is located at the brainstem. And as I said before, these brain regions are particularly susceptible to thiamine deficiency. So what do you think might happen when you do have a thiamine deficiency? Well, it turns out that you have abnormal vagal responses. You have abnormal vagal control, what they call poor vagal tone. Okay, this is essentially where the vagus nerve is not functioning as it should. It's not sending the messages as it should do. And what you essentially develop is a situation whereby the vagus nerve can no longer effectively send messages to the digestive organs to control things like digestive enzyme production or stomach acid secretion or small intestinal motility. Okay, for instance, I was talking about poor vagal tone, this dysfunction of the vagus nerve. Well, this is actually being identified in inflammatory bowel disorders or inflammatory bowel diseases like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, but also irritable bowel syndrome. And there are some researchers who would say that irritable bowel syndrome is up to 80% of cases of IBS are actually small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. If we look at some of the research, we also see that vagal nerve stimulation, which is like the artificial stimulation of this nerve to try to improve vagal tone, is actually being investigated as a possible treatment for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Okay, so the vagus nerve is extremely important in regulating how well the gut is actually functioning. Now, we were talking about the vagus nerve, and when we look at how the vagus nerve actually sends its messages, what it's doing is it's actually utilizing a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And acetylcholine It's operating both in the vagus nerve but also in the enteric neurons, so the gut nervous system as well. And this system is utilizing acetylcholine to basically send messages and activate various functions. And so one of those is to stimulate the intestinal contractions. Okay, so essentially what's happening is when we're digesting food, you know, we're chewing it in the mouth, it's going into the stomach, and when it reaches the small intestine, it's being met with pancreatic enzymes, we're getting a flush of bile from the gallbladder and the liver, and we're breaking down our macromolecules, our nutrients. And what we're doing, ideally what we want is the intestinal cells, or the intestinal wall, the smooth muscles lining the intestine, to actually contract. When these are contracting in what is called peristalsis, this is what is responsible for motility, for basically moving things down through the gut when they are ready to kind of move on to the next stage. And if we look at the pathogenesis of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, what we see is that it's generally characterized by a defect in motility. So it's usually slow motility, which is basically allowing food to sit in the small intestine for too long and actually allowing bacteria to ferment the products. And this is why people get bloating in the upper gut and things like gas and whatnot. So how can we maintain healthy gut motility and prevent or address small intestinal bacterial overgrowth? Well, essentially what we need is a healthy autonomic nervous system. Okay, we need the autonomic nervous system and the enteric neurons to be able to activate peristalsis. Okay, so for this we need good vagal tone. But on another level, which is implicating thymine once more, is that we need thymine for the synthesis of acetylcholine. Okay, research shows that when you have low thymine, you have low synthesis of acetylcholine. So this is another way that thymine seems to be essential for the way that the gut is functioning. And so, as I've just said, vagal and enteric acetylcholine synthesis or release is not only responsible for intestinal contractions, but actually it's the release of acetylcholine which is actually going to activate the secretion of digestive enzymes from the pancreas. Okay, it's going to activate the release of bile from the gallbladder and from the liver. Okay, and what we're also going to see is the vagus nerve and the enteric neurons essentially releasing acetylcholine. This is actually going to activate gastric acid secretion in the stomach as well. Now, gastric acid secretion, there are multiple different components to this, but acetylcholine coming from the nervous system is actually one of those. Okay, so nervous system function is really important for stomach acid secretion. And if we look again at the pathogenesis of, or the risk factors for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, we see that low stomach acid is one of those, and poor bile flow is another one. I would also add that poor digestive enzyme secretion or production is going to be another factor which is going to predispose someone to gut issues. And if you notice, everyone in the functional medicine world is prescribing digestive enzymes. They're prescribing hydrochloric acid for the stomach. They're prescribing ox bile salts. Okay, clearly many people are having major issues producing their own, and I would posit that at least some people are actually unable to produce it, not because they don't have the raw materials, but more likely that there is faulty autonomic control, or that there is some kind of dysautonomia which is actually disrupting the vagal tone, lowering the vagal tone, and actually getting in the way of our body's sort of message to tell us that we need to make that. So moving on, when we actually get into the intestine, we see that to digest food, I've just been talking about the secretion of digestive enzymes from the pancreas, but you also have other digestive enzymes, and these are what we call brush border enzymes. These are basically dotted on the intestinal lining, and these are like the final stage for breaking down very basic molecules into glucose, into amino acids and whatnot, okay? And so if these enzymes aren't functioning, then what we're potentially going to end up with is undigested carbohydrates, undigested proteins, undigested fats. What the research shows, and I want to thank Dave Mayo for this actually, because Dave Mayo over at Hack Your Gut, he's one of the only people kind of in the nutrition related field who is talking about, or who has written about how thiamine, long-term thiamine deficiency can actually negatively impact gut health. There's not many other people who I'm aware of who've really gone into the depths that he has, so I just want to credit him here because I think he's done a fantastic job. I actually picked this up from his blog, the fact that thiamine deficiency is reducing brush border enzymes. There's a very interesting study showing that it's reducing the enzymes on that brush border of the intestine, but at the same time it's also reducing intestinal weight. Now, you have to understand that the cells of the intestine have a very high turnover rate, and when the cells have a very high turnover rate, these cells generally rely heavily on the pentose phosphate pathway. Now, if you refer back to the pentose phosphate pathway, we were talking about how thiamine is a cofactor for the transketolase enzyme, and so essentially these cells lining the intestine need a bunch of thiamine to run through that pentose phosphate pathway to continue to synthesize things like nucleic acids and whatnot, because they're continually having to produce new cells, okay? So there's a very high thiamine burden on these cells, and so it's possible at least that the reduced intestinal weight has to do with a slowdown of the turnover of these cells. This is potentially going to reduce the integrity of the intestinal lining, reduce the health of the cells, and actually reduce like the local protection that we have in terms of protecting against things like leaky gut and whatnot. Now, if we do think about leaky gut, there are lots of people lots of kind of practitioners who utilize things like leaky gut protocols, and you're using amino acids like L-glutamine, you're using perhaps some herbs like slippery elm or whatever, aloe vera, I don't know, there's lots of different protocols, but essentially, whilst I think they have their place in certain circumstances, I don't necessarily think that they are going to fix something that is being driven from a mechanism or a process which is coming from up top, basically. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that if we look at what is controlling whether the gut is leaky or not, what is controlling the intestinal permeability, we see that immune activation is a key factor. Okay, so if there's anything which is kind of activating, triggering the immune system, then we're going to naturally have an increase in gut permeability. One of those things which automatically comes to mind is something like oxalate. Okay, oxalate is going to have the ability to do that in the gut. But there's also other things such as pesticides, You know, do we know if glyphosate does that? There's all kinds of chemicals and toxins that we're coming into contact with, which are potentially going to increase that intestinal permeability. But when we take a top-down approach, we have to look at the physiology as well. And actually, when you look at another factor which is controlling the intestinal permeability from the top, like a higher level mechanism, we see that the vagus nerve again takes center stage here. It plays a key role. It's actually responsible for tightening up that gut barrier. Okay, it maintains the intestinal barrier by increasing expression of occludin tight junction proteins. So you have zonular occludins, you have occludin, and essentially what these are doing is you can think of it in a simple way as gluing the gut together. And the vagus nerve is responsible for increasing the expression of these. Now, vagal nerve stimulation, get this, research shows that vagal nerve stimulation can actually protect the gut barrier against lipopolysaccharide-induced permeability and prevent burn-induced permeability. So essentially, in animal models, when you have a very high lipopolysaccharide burden, otherwise known as endotoxin, this is a way to induce gut permeability. Another way is to severely burn an animal. This induces gut permeability, but what we're seeing is that actually simultaneous vagal nerve stimulation is actually protecting the gut against that. So the vagus nerve clearly plays a key role in actually modulating the gut barrier, helping us keep it robust, and again points to thymine. Now let me read out the conclusion of this study. So it's saying that vagal activity provides a protective function to the intestinal epithelial barrier, and listen, a low vagal activity makes intestinal epithelium more permeable, thus promoting systemic inflammation and chronic disease. Okay, so what this is pointing to is how important the vagus nerve really is in actually allowing our gut to do what it needs to do. And it gets even better than this. So the vagus nerve is actually not only in control of modulating gut permeability, but actually it modulates inflammatory responses throughout the whole of the periphery. Okay, it's quite amazing in that essentially this state of chronic inflammation that so many people seem to be in with various chronic illnesses, the vagus nerve, vagal activity can actually do its job to quell that inflammation. Say if the immune system is overactive, it's gone into overdrive, the vagus nerve can essentially reduce that inflammation when it doesn't need to be there. And you can think of it like the off switch. It does this via something called the anti-inflammatory cholinergic pathway. So you have acetylcholine, once again, key neurotransmitter in the vagus nerve. Acetylcholine binds to certain receptors called alpha-7 nicotinic receptors. Okay, what it's doing is it's binding to these receptors, and these are on immune cells in the gut, all right? And the effect is to inhibit pro-inflammatory mediators such as TNF-alpha. Okay, how many times are you told about gut inflammation, about reducing gut inflammation? And there are lots of different supplements that have been designed to do this, you know, like take this supplement and you will reduce your inflammation. But in fact, what it seems like is that actually our body can control these things, but we need the vagus nerve to be functioning at a sufficient level. Okay, so how is this important in terms of dysbiosis as well? Not only small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, but how does this higher level mechanism, this mechanism of the vagus nerve innervating the gut and actually reducing inflammation in the gut, how can this actually affect the bacteria in the gut? Because it does affect the bacteria in the gut. You know, many people are led to believe, there are even many researchers who think that the gut bacteria is solely based on what we are eating. And I mean, there's so much conflicting information. I mean, I don't pretend to have any idea about the gut bacteria. I don't know if anyone does, but what it seems like is that there are any number of things that can change the gut bacteria that you have at any given moment. And I think there's even research to say that, you know, your thoughts, your feelings can change the type of bacteria living in your gut. So it's infinitely complex. But there's this very interesting paper that came out not long ago. It was actually showing how, because the gut bacteria, they take the rap for a lot of the things that go wrong in, you know, in functional medicine, in nutrition, in alternative health. You know, the idea is that if we fix the bacteria, then actually what we're going to do is we're going to fix the whole body. But I think the actual state of the environment in the body often gets overlooked. You know, it turns out, it seems anyway, that the state of the body, the state and the health and the functioning of the cells themselves are actually key determinants of the type of bacteria which is residing in the gut. And this is because, or this is potentially because, the cells lining the gut are essentially releasing metabolites. They're releasing metabolic byproducts from the way that they function. These are getting out into the gut. These are promoting a certain environment in the gut. There's this very interesting paper, and it was called Colonocyte Metabolism Shapes the Gut Microbiota. Now, can you get what that's saying? That's saying that the way that the colonocytes, the intestinal cells, are metabolizing things is essentially having a shaping effect on the gut microbiome. This particular study showed that they were producing abnormal quantities of molecular oxygen and nitrate. Okay, what this is theoretically proposed to do, this molecular oxygen and nitrate is getting out into the intestinal lumen. So it's getting into the intestine, basically the tube of the intestine. And this is theorized to facilitate the growth of facultative anaerobic bacteria in the gut. Okay, so the way that the cells are functioning are essentially causing a dysbiosis in the bacteria. Not necessarily because the bacteria are to blame, but because the health of the cells themselves are the thing which is driving it. And why am I talking about this right now? Well, what we're talking about is inflammation in the gut. If there's inflammation in the cells of the gut, potentially driving dysbiosis, well, what is involved in controlling inflammation in the gut? The vagus nerve. The vagus nerve plays a key role here. If we go back to this slide, we see how the vagus nerve is essentially turning down the pro-inflammatory mediators from these immune cells. And so we need to try to find ways to optimize the way that the vagus nerve is actually functioning. So ideally, this implicates the vagus nerve, and by doing so, we are implicating thiamine. Because thiamine, as we've seen before, thiamine is absolutely critical for vagal tone. Okay, so taking a top-down systemic approach, if we look at elevated intestinal permeability, intestinal inflammation, this is causing potentially systemic inflammation. Okay, now the vagus nerve or autonomic nervous system maintaining good autonomic tone, vagal tone, this is key to controlling these processes, and this requires thiamine. It also requires a bunch of other nutrients, but since this talk is specifically about thiamine, then it's important to know that thiamine clearly plays a key role in this. And so when we look at gut dysfunction, should we be focusing purely on giving gut supplements? Should we be focusing purely on the gut itself, or should we be looking from a whole body kind of systems approach and seeing that actually perhaps the problem is coming from, perhaps it's a systemic issue? You know, perhaps it's related to a systemic deficiency of something, which is essentially preventing the cells of our body to be able to produce sufficient energy. Okay, in other words, is it a systemic bioenergetic deficit? And when we think about killing strategies for things like SIBO, generally they don't tend to work. For some people it does, whereas for many other people it only provides temporary results. And so we have to ask the question, why is gut motility not functioning? Why can the body not produce enough stomach acid? Why can we not produce enough bile? Why can we not produce enough pancreatic enzymes? These are all questions we need to be asking. And so if we are to connect the dots, the autonomic nervous system is involved in the secretion of stomach acid, pancreatic enzymes, and brush border enzymes, release bile from the liver, maintains regular intestinal peristalsis and motility, reduces intestinal permeability, and reduces inflammation. Thymine's key role in energy metabolism of the brain regions responsible for controlling autonomic balance, coupled with its role in acetylcholine synthesis, indicate that a deficiency of this nutrient could easily cause the symptoms which we associate with gut dysfunction. Okay? Now, does it mimic and does it cause SIBO? I think this is highly possible in some people. You see, the characteristic features or the symptoms of SIBO are bloating. We have gas, intestinal gas, infrequent bowel movements or abnormal bowel movements. We may have diarrhea and then constipation, and this fluctuates. We have abdominal pain. There are many other kinds of symptoms of these as well. But if you look at these symptoms, these are all common in another condition which is called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. POTS, to be abbreviated, this condition is essentially a prime example of dysautonomia. And there seems to be a lot of evidence to say that POTS is in fact, at least for some people, an early manifestation of chronic thiamine deficiency. Okay, one study actually said that this same autonomic impairment that leads to POTS may also infect the enteric nervous system, leading to gastroparesis, abnormal gut motility, and esophageal reflux. Okay, so these symptoms, which are common in dysautonomia, are practically identical to those of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Okay, and this also applies to many other functional gut disorders. The question is, are these gut disorders, are they in and of themselves manifestations of this dysautonomia? Is it manifesting mostly in the gut? Does this happen for some people, or does it have to go along with all of the other symptoms of POTS? That's a question that I don't know how to answer, but I think it's possible that for some people at least, poor vagal tone is going to manifest mainly in the gut. And as I'm sure that the listener can probably appreciate now, is that thiamine is absolutely, therefore, crucial because of its role in the autonomic nervous system, because of its role producing acetylcholine, because of its role in systemic energy metabolism. It's therefore absolutely crucial for maintaining gut health. And it's unfortunate that more people are not speaking about this, because I think it's a topic that is under acknowledged, and I think that more people suffer from this than ever before. Now, before we kind of round this up, I would just like to talk about some other issues related to the gut. Okay, so as I'm sure many of the audience already know, when we do have any kind of gut dysfunction, say when we have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, there is generally some kind of malabsorption, especially if it is characterized by diarrhea. So if we have any kind of malabsorption going on, then the water-soluble vitamins, they can easily become depleted, and malabsorption is a key risk factor for thiamine deficiency. However, if someone already has gut issues, if they were not previously low in thiamine, it's possible that gut issues or some kind of dysbiosis, some kind of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth could actually potentially cause thiamine deficiency in some individuals. Okay, and I think that this relates to a gas which is called hydrogen sulfide. Okay, so hydrogen sulfide, there is actually a condition called hydrogen sulfide dominant small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, characterized by various bacteria, some of which are called the sulfate reducing bacteria, and what they're essentially doing, taking dietary forms of sulfur, combining them with hydrogen and actually producing this hydrogen sulfide gas. This is in the gut, but this can also travel in the blood. Okay, now generally in these cases there is impaired sulfoxidation, so you often get a buildup of sulfite and potentially less sulfate. Okay, and we know from the research that sulfite actually is toxic in many ways to the cell, but what it does is it cleaves thiamine and its methylene bridge, essentially renders the vitamin ineffective. Okay, so it's therefore possible that thiamine in the gut from the food that you're eating, if you are producing a bunch of hydrogen sulfide, then it's possible that that hydrogen sulfide is potentially going to degrade that in the gut. But what the animal research actually shows is that sulfide, what it can do is it can reduce the concentration of thiamine in white blood cells, and it's been studied in ruminants in the animal research to basically find better ways to like feed cattle and feed ruminants, because there were concerns about there being too much sulfur because it was potentially causing like brain damage in the animals. And so there is some data to show that hydrogen sulfide actually increases the requirement of thiamine in the brain and central nervous system, and elevated levels of hydrogen sulfide can eventually lead to thiamine deficiency in these animals. Additionally, thiamine supplementation actually protects animals against sulfide toxicity. So it's possible that if you're someone with impaired sulfur metabolism, if you're someone who is reacting to sulfur containing foods, if you get symptoms which relate to elevated sulfites, you know, if you're reacting to sulfites in foods as well, sulfite additives, and if you are potentially producing lots of hydrogen sulfide in your gut, then there is a good chance that this could possibly degrade thiamine, either incoming into the gut or potentially the thiamine that's stored in your body already. Now, for those of you who are thinking that thiamine deficiency is a thing of the past, anyone who studied nutrition probably was taught that, or studied medicine. We learned that thiamine deficiency was a thing of the past. It's not common anymore. It was eradicated with fortification. Well, I think that that is woefully wrong. In fact, I think that they couldn't be more wrong about that topic. And now I really believe that it's a deficiency of epic proportions, and I only really developed this knowledge after reading just an extraordinary book on this topic. I really cannot recommend this book highly enough. In fact, I wouldn't describe it as a reading book. It's very much a clinical tool for me, and I found that I've been to this book back and forth on many different occasions because it's so jam-packed full of information, and that's by Dr. Derek Lonsdale and Chandler Mars. And so they've done just a fantastic job at really going through the details of the biochemistry, really fleshing out exactly what is driving these deficiencies, why it's so common in our modern world, and what you can potentially do about that. Okay, and so just to give the reader a brief idea, one, I recommend that you go out and purchase this book because it is highly recommended. But just to give you a basic idea as to some of the reasons why thiamine deficiency actually seems to be so common in our modern world, I think the main reason is high, like calorically dense foods, which are heavily processed and essentially what we call empty calories. So what we're doing is we are taking the micronutrients from the foods and we are essentially refining them and adding in suboptimal levels of these vitamins, and oftentimes is forms of these vitamins that are cheap that we can't even really make use of very well. And so what we essentially do is we take out the goodness and we're replacing it with suboptimal forms. And actually it's the excessive intake of these refined carbohydrates, refined sugars, even refined fats to some extent. Essentially what we're doing is we are depleting ourselves of thiamine. And I think that this is particularly exacerbated by sugar and carbohydrate, because when you look at the basic biochemistry of thiamine, we see that thiamine is so important in glucose processing. And Chris Mastodron actually made a very obvious point that I don't think many people really talk about, is that when you are consuming carbohydrates, you're essentially using a lot more thiamine because you're using this enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase, whereas in the metabolism of fats, you bypass pyruvate dehydrogenase, so you're not using up as much thiamine. Now you're going to use it for the other enzymes, but essentially every time you process carbohydrates or sugar, you are using up significantly more thiamine than you would otherwise. And the problem with this is that many of the things which contain sugar are usually depleting thiamine as well. So what you're doing by consuming sugar, by consuming refined carbohydrates, a very quick and easy way to deplete your body of thiamine. And again, I can't recommend this book enough, but some basic practical tips that I can recommend for the listener is to, if you're looking to try to find ways that you can spare thiamine in your body, that you can try to optimize your status, then adopting a thiamine sparing diet. So a diet that is not going to deplete your body of thiamine and is actually potentially going to use a lot less thiamine. For that, I personally would recommend a lower carbohydrate diet. A lower carbohydrate diet rich in thiamine containing foods, pork, liver, turkey, chicken drumsticks, any animal foods. If your diet is predominantly based on animal food calories, then you're going to really take down your requirement for thiamine, whilst at the same time you're going to be providing your body with quite a good dose of thiamine as well. Another thing to consider here is reducing the triggers or reducing the factors which block your body's absorption of thiamine. So for instance, coffee and the tannins in tea, these can essentially inactivate thiamine in the gut, or they can form complexes. Can't remember exactly the mechanism, but essentially they stop our body from being able to absorb thiamine. So drinking these drinks all of the time with every meal, I would not recommend that. I would say if you're going to drink coffee, drink it away from meals. And ideally, you shouldn't be drinking coffee in the afternoon anyway, because that's not very good for your sleep, let's be honest. And finally, something that I'd just like to add, temporary support I think is probably necessary. I find in my clients that people benefit greatly from actually supplementing with an active form of thiamine. So there's various kinds. I know that thiamine hydrochloride, which is the average form, the bioavailability, as per my understanding, is not very good, something like 10% or something. So I personally would not recommend thiamine hydrochloride. Instead I would recommend like a benfotiamine, or even better, if you can get hold of allithiamine or lipothiamine. The chemical name is tetrahydrofurfuryl disulfide, very long name, but essentially this is a special formulation, which means that it can readily cross the blood-brain barrier and all these kinds of things. If you buy the book, then yeah, if you buy the book Thiamine Deficiency Disease, Dysautonomia and High Calorie Malnutrition, the authors of that book essentially explain the different forms, explain which one is best to use clinically speaking. But generally, if you are going to take a thiamine supplement, it's good to try get magnesium with that, because magnesium is also a cofactor in many of the enzymes which are thiamine dependent. So just to round everything up, what I really would have liked to get across in this presentation is that the gut needs thiamine. It needs thiamine for multiple different things. We need it for the health of the intestinal cells. We need it for the production of neurotransmitters. We need it for the production of energy. Okay, we need it for coordination of the autonomic nervous system, particularly the vagus nerve, which is in control of gut permeability, gut motility, enzyme secretion, bile secretion, gastric acid secretion. All of the things which we associate with gut health is essentially at least partially controlled or governed by the autonomic nervous system operating through the vagus nerve, which relies on thiamine. Okay, this is not only for neurotransmission, but at the same time, principal neurotransmitter being acetylcholine, the vagus nerve is particularly dependent on thiamine. And so, if you've tried gut protocols, you've tried killer strategies, you've tried supplementing with enzymes, you've tried all of these things to promote motility and whatnot, and you're still not seeing benefits, I would highly consider that there may be something in terms of a long-term chronic like insufficiency or deficiency, which is potentially at the root of your problem. And getting to the root of that is going to be important, and it might not be related to thiamine, but it potentially could be related to thiamine. And if it is, then I would highly recommend taking some extra thiamine support, go on a thiamine sparing diet, and try to investigate this with a healthcare practitioner who knows how to test for thiamine, knows the test to look for, and can potentially support you with that. So thank you for watching. I hope that this video was helpful. I hope the presentation was understandable. And I really hope that the audience can appreciate the essential roles that thiamine plays in maintaining gut health. So if you like this video or you found it helpful, please like and subscribe to this page. You can also find me on Facebook as Facebook/EO Nutrition. You can find my website at www.eonutrition.co.uk. And just to let people know that I do take private clients and I do work remotely via Skype and other online methods. So if you are interested in booking a consultation, then please reach out to me. Also, if you found it helpful, then try to share it on social media. If there's anyone that you think that this might apply to, share it with them, and hopefully it could provide some insight. Now, that's all for today, and I will see you next time. I am going to be making lots more videos in the future, so stay tuned.